No, first of all, David, I think the president should stop apologizing, stop being defensive. The reality is the NSA has saved thousands of lives, not just in the United States, but also in France and Germany and throughout Europe. Quite frankly, the NSA has done so much for our country and so much to help this president in his term. He should be out there. He's the commander-in-chief. He should stand with NSA. He should go out and visit Fort Meade and be there with General Alexander and the troops there.
Welcome to Opinion Journal Live. I'm Dan Henninger, substituting for Mary Kissel. Well, the stories about the U.S. National Security Agency monitoring the phones of European leaders and others has launched at least one word into the stratosphere: outrage. That word appears in virtually every story, and it's not clear to me who's more outraged, Europe's leaders or the reporters writing the stories. But in any event, once we get past the expressions of shock, we have to ask one simple question. Who's going to benefit from these stories and who's going to lose? Here to talk about that with me is Wall Street Journal editorial page editor Paul Gigot.
I'm not outraged, Dan.
I was just going to ask you that. You don't look particularly shocked. Why
I've been
not?
around a long time. It's hard to shock me, especially about spying.
So what would you say is the reality inside these revelations?
Well, one is everybody does it. Spying on other governments is something governments do, and they do it for reasons of national security, and sometimes there's a very good reason for it. The United States has an agreement with 4 other governments, the Anglo government, so-called, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, and Australia, which we have agreed not to spy on each other and to share intelligence. But we don't do that with other countries, and we don't do it for good national security reasons.
Yeah, and I think we should point out as well that all of these countries, especially France, Germany, have their own intelligence agencies,
yes.
And they're not asleep. They actually often do pretty good work.
That's right, and we share that information with them, and the French in particular have a much less domestic oversight than we do. Basically what the Élysée Palace decides it wants to do, it does.
Yeah. Well, we should point out these are all of this is the result of the great NSA leaker, Mr. Snowden,
right.
Who is pouring these materials out. It is causing problems. I mean, some of the European leaders, not everyone is a head of state like Angela Merkel or François Hollande. Some of these other lower-level officials are saying, for instance, that the free trade agreement, transatlantic free trade agreement that is now under discussion should perhaps be set aside because we can't trust the Americans.
Yeah, it's creating political problems for the leadership over there because their populations and many of their media are professing outrage. You know, there's an already anti-American audience in a lot of these European countries, and this plays into that. And the Snowden narrative, if you will, that somehow there's an American super intelligence state out of control without any restraints is filtered into some of that understanding in these countries. I think it's false, but that's what they choose to believe. And that's creating political pressure on these heads of state and therefore political problems in our relationship with them that may have policy ramifications.
Well, speaking of heads of state, we opened the segment with Congressman Peter King, who this past weekend was pretty severely critical of President Obama for not standing up and defending the NSA against these accusations.
Right. Well, I think that there's an obligation on political leaders to educate, not merely to respond to the faux outrage to the extent it's faux in these countries and say, oh my God, I'm shocked, but to say, look, this happens. This is why it happens. We're going to see if we can limit it perhaps to some way, but educate the country. And I think that's especially important with President Obama, since he represents the country that is accused of doing this. And they've been very defensive. I mean, you never hear this president stand up and say, or almost never, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and here's why we need to continue doing it. Instead, it's defensive. Well, we'll review it. Now we have a story in this morning's paper saying, hey, I didn't know. I didn't know any of this stuff. You know, I'm shocked. Okay, we'll stop. I mean, that just feeds the idea that there's something wrong with it rather than saying, look, here's why we do it. Here's why we have to.
All right. Thanks so much, Paul.